Good morning. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. To our studio audience, again, good morning. To our virtual audience, whether you're in Europe or anywhere else, good afternoon or good evening. So we have a terrific and a somewhat unusual event this morning. We are hosting, of course, Mr. Stefanchuk, the Rada parliamentary speaker in Ukraine. And we've hosted him before, and it's our great honor to host him. But we also have the thematic scheme to this. So the speaker will offer remarks, and after that we'll have a very eminent panel to discuss Russian disinformation in the war and its impact in Washington and on the war. But before we get to that, as again part of this unusual event, we will have a presentation from two congresspeople. We have Congressman McCall, representative of Texas, former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Congressman Quigley, a Democrat from Illinois. And so you'll have a video from them, and then the speaker will speak, and then we'll have a panel. So let's put the speakers on, our Congress folks on.
Hello, I'm Michael McCall, Chairman Emeritus of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a staunch ally of the Ukrainian people. Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine was an inflection point, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world. My father served in World War II as a bombardier on a B-17. He bombed the Nazis. His service and the greatest generation inspired me and taught me the importance of standing up for freedom and democracy against tyranny and oppression. And that's what I've tried to do here in Congress. And that's why, as chairman, I led the passage of the Emergency Wartime Supplemental Bill last year. If we had not passed that bill, I believe Russia would be occupying Ukraine today. That is Vladimir Putin's goal, to seize all of Ukraine, and he won't stop there. The Russian Federation will use any means necessary to make that happen. They've already abducted at least 20,000 children that we know of. I think the number is much higher. And every expert I've talked to agrees that the number is probably closer to 100,000. They're also indoctrinating and militarizing up to 1 million Ukraine children in occupied territories. Horrific. Next week, I'm hosting a showing of the new Ukrainian film, Children in the Fire, which highlights Russia's crimes against humanity and against these children. We must continue to raise awareness about the plight of Ukrainian children. In addition, Putin has orchestrated a massive information warfare campaign, both in Russia and across the West. Unfortunately, Russian propaganda has made its way into our country, and at times into the Republican Party. Talking heads in the United States have claimed that Ukraine is the aggressor and that it historically belongs to Russia. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a lie. Putin always wants to convince the West that Moscow will win this war. He knows that if the United States and our allies believe Ukraine has no chance of winning, that we won't give them the aid that they need. In fact, in these negotiations, so-called negotiations, Putin has not made one concession, and I don't think he has any intention of doing so. Time and time again, Ukraine has surprised the world. Ukrainians are a tough and resilient people, and they will do anything to defend their homeland. A war that we thought would end in 3 days has now raged on for nearly 4 years. Moscow's capture of small territories and towns has come at a disproportionate cost. Russian forces are suffering 20,000 to 25,000 deaths a month, according to NATO's Secretary General. With these truths in mind, the West must continue to support Ukraine and be clear-eyed about Putin. He does not want peace, and he will not stop his war of aggression until enough pressure is placed upon him. Like Russian sanctions, we must pass an additional Russian sanctions bill now. Now is not the time to back down. Now is the time to continue fighting. And I look forward to visiting Ukraine in the coming weeks to receive an award from Rada, the parliament, and also from President Zelensky to receive a presidential citation. and to continue showing Congress's support for the Ukrainian people's fight. I also keep standing up for the thousands of children who have been ripped away from their families. They are always in my prayers and in my heart. Their return must be a top priority for all freedom-loving people. For at the end of the day, we are all God's children. Thank you, and Slava Ukraine.
Good morning, and welcome to everyone here today. I want to thank Chairman Ruslan Stefanchuk of the Rada of Ukraine for being with us. Chairman Stefanchuk, your leadership and the courage of the Ukrainian people you represent continues to inspire democracies across the world. I'd also like to thank Ambassador John Herbst and the Atlantic Council for convening this discussion and giving me the opportunity to share a few reflections as you begin today's conversation. I'm Congressman Mike Quigley, proud to represent the people of Illinois' 5th District, including the great city of Chicago. I also serve as the co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Ukraine Caucus, now nearly 100 members strong. That bipartisan strength matters because it reflects something fundamental. Across party lines, we understand that Ukraine's fight is not a distant regional conflict. It is the defining test of liberty, sovereignty, and democratic resolve in our time. I'm also a member of the House Intelligence Committee, where I've seen firsthand how wide the gap is between Kremlin propaganda and the reality on the ground. Putin is not defending Russia. He is prosecuting a war of conquest aimed at destroying Ukrainian nationhood itself. Moscow's propaganda claims otherwise, insisting that Russia is winning and that Ukraine is somehow responsible for this war. That lie has found an alarming supporter in the White House. President Zelensky said it best last year when he warned that Trump lives in a disinformation space shaped by Russian propaganda. President Trump has repeatedly and falsely suggested that Ukraine started this war, an assertion that directly reflects Kremlin talking points and ignores the basic fact that Russia invaded a sovereign nation in 2022. Putin pushes these lies because facts are devastating to his case. Since the invasion began, Russia has suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, including as many as 325,000 killed, the highest losses of any major power since World War II. In exchange, Russia has gained almost nothing. Russia also increasingly survives by leaning on a new axis of evil: China, Iran, and North Korea. Yet disinformation persists. If Trump embraces Russian propaganda, support weakens, resolve fractures, and Putin gets what he wants without any facts changing on the battlefield. That is why leadership matters. Words matter. Repeating Kremlin lies from the American political stage doesn't make peace more likely. It rewards aggression and invites more of it. Ukraine is not losing. Russia is not winning. Ukraine is fighting for its survival. And Russia is bleeding for an illusion. History is still being written, and with clarity, unity, and resolve, it will not be written by Putin. Thank you.
Okay, it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce Ruslan Stefanchuk, the Speaker of the Rada.
Hello, I'm Michael McCall, Chairman Emeritus of the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Well, sometimes even we make mistakes. Look, so I've had the pleasure of meeting him even before he became Speaker of the Rada, shortly after President Zelensky won the 2019 election. And I've seen him regularly both in Kiev, and we've had the honor of hosting him here more than once. So, Mr. Speaker, over to you, please.
Dear colleagues, I would ask you to use the headphone because I'll speak in Ukrainian, and if you don't know Ukrainian, it will be better for you for understand me. Вельмишановний пане посол Гербст,
Dear Ambassador Herbst, dear friends, dear experts, first of all, I would like to thank you for this warm introduction of me on this platform. This is not my first time here, but I'm always pleased to have the opportunity to talk with the expert community, with our colleagues and friends of Ukraine. So today, it's a great honor for me to be represented here at the Atlantic Council. I'm very thankful to the team of the Atlantic Council for creating the space for open and serious discussions about the security, power, and most importantly, responsibility in the 21st century. Also, I would like to thank each of you for your great attention to what's happening in Ukraine. That is probably one of the most valuable things here on this platform, we can talk about those problems, about the trouble, but also most importantly about the ways out of that terrible war that is still going on in our country. And Ukraine profoundly values your unshakable support and continuous involvement in the most difficult years of our newest history. Today, like never before, it's important to understand what truly happens in the war in Ukraine. Let's be honest, and it was mentioned today, Russia continuously trying to distort reality. Let us be frank. Sometimes they do it quite successfully because they use their KGB tradition of manipulation and wide network of dissemination of information, the various information agencies, and they do everything to ensure that the processes in society get attacked by in the information war. This is why it is very important to understand what really is happening in Ukraine and in this war that was launched by Russia against Ukraine. However, the most dreadful consequence of those manipulations is that Russia is trying to create an illusion, the illusion that they are capable of overcoming, overwhelming Europe and the United States and defeat the united democratic world. This is why I hope that our discussion today will help to dissuade at least two important myths. The myths that Russian Federation continuously spreads. One is about Putin's victory in Ukraine is inevitable, and two is that they are capable of defeating the United Democratic Forces, which they continuously try to intimidate and threaten with nuclear or other dangers. But the reality is that in a few days, Ukraine, unfortunately, will face the 4th anniversary of this war, this terrible aggression, which means Ukraine is fighting, and it will never surrender to the mercy of the aggressor. But let us be honest, Russia also continues to systematically terrorize the people of Ukraine. You know that almost every night, sometimes in the daytime as well, Ukraine experiences terrible strikes by Russian ballistic missiles and drones. They attack critical infrastructure and peaceful citizens. And this looks particularly cynical when Russia is trying to use the complicated winter weather, because now sometimes during such strikes, the temperature falls below the record lows of the recent decades. That's negative 20, 22 Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that would be like negative 13, but you need to understand that sometimes Russia uses cold as weapon, this means that nothing has changed. Likewise, more than 90 years ago, they were using hunger, starvation as a weapon. But now, as it was pointed out by our esteemed colleagues from the US Congress, Ukraine can and must come as a winner in this war. And there are many components here. The very fact that Ukraine is still standing in this war for 4 years, that already is a big victory of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian spirit, and the Ukrainian armed forces. However, for us, a victory cannot be to continue war forever. But so we want a fair and stable peace. But that cannot happen without a systemic and proper support on behalf of our partners. For Ukraine, the issue of strengthening our defense capabilities is not an abstract issue. And of course, it's not about the militarization of Ukraine's society. Most of all, it's defense of our families, of our schools and hospitals. It's ensuring that our energy system is operational and allowing people to live their day-to-day lives under this constant, continuous threat. So sanctions against the aggressor play a decisive role, and they need to become really unified and overwhelming. Membership in the EU and NATO are also vitally important for Ukraine. It's a guarantee that our existential choice will be unchanged and irreversible. At the same time as we strengthen our defenses, Ukraine, like no one else in the world, wants peace. And by using this opportunity, I want to express our sincere gratitude to the US Congress and the administration for the effort aimed at ending this war, because bipartisan support and the solidarity are extremely important for us. I would like to inform you that yesterday and today I had very meaningful and substantive meetings with Speaker Mike Johnson, Senators Graham and Blumenthal, the Senate Ukrainian caucus, and other officials and important figures, and we discussed a number of important questions, and it is those meetings that give me reasons to say that Ukraine is not alone. Ukraine is using the Ukraine has strategic support of the United States, and all measures will be taken to stop the Russian Federation. I cannot disclose every detail of the talks we had, but they are about serious measures which where the parliaments of our two countries will show their capability in regard of adoption of certain laws and ratification of certain agreements, and important decisions there will need to be supported by the two parliaments, including on issues of transfer of certain weapon systems to Ukraine. Apart from that, I would like to say that Ukraine has never been an obstacle to reaching peace. You know that President Zelensky was saying from the very first days of the invasion, he was saying, we are ready to talk about peace. He traveled to Istanbul waiting for Putin to arrive. So lengthy and durable peace is important for us. But at the same time, Ukraine has clear and understandable red lines which cannot be crossed for us. And the main ones, number one, is respect to our territorial integrity and sovereignty. Ukraine cannot and will not take any action that contradict the Constitution of Ukraine. Number two is our sovereign right to choose our own alliances, because Ukraine, that used to be a member, a component of the Soviet Union, we know very well that unions can be different kind. And this is a worldview choice for us to be a part of the civilized world. And of course, it is also not allowing to restrict our right for self-defense. Only the right for self-defense can guarantee the future for our people, for Ukraine. This is why peace has to be strong and fair. And the world has to make a new war impossible. Dear friends, I have presented my brief reflections in this complicated moment for Ukraine, the world, and this is a complicated fight, but we will stand through, owing to our reliable partners like the United States, the European friends and partners. And I would like to express again our deep gratitude to the great American people, the President Trump, Speaker Johnson, the Congress and the administration for the unprecedented support of Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, in our fight for freedom, independence, and peace. Dear friends, a long time ago we stopped believing in myths. We also have lost fear. We live with faith and hope to have the war end, to achieve fair and lengthy peace, to rebuild and flourish. This faith and hope will live as long as we are alive. Thank you for your attention, and glory to Ukraine.
Sneak around you. Is my mic on? Yes, it is. So again, welcome. We now have the panel part of this morning's conversation, and we have terrific panelists besides, of course, the Speaker of the Rada. We have Julia Davis, who's the founder of Russian Media Monitor, something I recommend to everyone. You can find her easily on X or Google her. You'll learn, if you just follow that, how senior Russian officials talk all the time about the United States being adversary number one to Russia. And for that matter, on Russian major media, sponsored by the government, people make fun of President Trump. We have with us also Lieutenant General David Deptula, who's the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. And I can tell you he's about the sharpest mind in this country on air power and strategy for air and war. And we have also Casey Michel, who's an author and a journalist. He's written, among other books, American Kleptocracy. He's written a paper for us here at the Eurasia Center on Russian media narratives. And let me make one point before we turn to our panel. The Kremlin has assiduously promoted the idea that they are inevitably winning this war, and they will inevitably take more Ukrainian territory, even though the big invasion began almost 4 years ago, and they still have not captured all of Donbass. And the narrative, which is picked up by naive types in the West, that Russia is inevitably winning, is meant to discourage the West from giving Ukraine the support to actually begin to drive Russian forces out of occupied Ukrainian territory. Because despite the narrative that Russia is inevitably winning, no, they're not inevitably winning. And in recent days, someone came up with a very clever idea to compare the forward advance of the Russian army in Ukraine to the pace a snail can move in 24 hours, which apparently is 25 meters. And the Russian army is moving at a slightly faster pace than a snail, and incurring, as Congressman McCall, Chairman McCall said, truly overwhelming casualties, to the point now that they are unable to replace the soldiers they've lost, not just with Russians who are unwilling to fight, but even with people they euchre into Russia from the global south and then send them to the front lines. Okay, enough from me. So we'll start with Julia Davis, who will tell us what the Russians are saying about the dynamics of the war. And Julia, please, 4 to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Honored to be here. In the years preceding the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian state media, which is tightly controlled by the government, started to lay the groundwork to explain why this was necessary, and their motivation was explained as the need to restore some version of the Soviet Union or a modified Russian empire that would be restored that way. Closer to the full-scale invasion, they started to lay the groundwork for the inevitable casualties. They've instituted new legislation for the rules of mass burials, so they were preparing the public for the inevitable casualties that might come along. But at the same time, leading propagandists that are personally decorated and honored by President Putin started to say that this would be a quick and easy operation. It would be very similar to the annexation of Crimea. The West's sanctions would be essentially toothless, and everyone would learn to live with the new reality. Then Putin announced the beginning of the so-called special operation, and suddenly there was a new concept that came to be announced, and that is to claim that the Ukrainian government is comprised of the Nazis and they needed the denazification. All of a sudden, they no longer spoke about the so-called restoration of the Soviet Union that they asserted Ukraine also wanted, and they attempted to run with the idea of denazification that didn't catch on as well as they thought, but they did air the footage from World War II where they would show the hangings of the Germans in Kiev, predicting that that soon would be the so-called Nazi government of Ukraine. Of course, the invasion did not turn out the way that they've anticipated, and suddenly the rhetoric started to shift. They claimed that too many Ukrainians who they previously said would be happy to be liberated and would greet them with flowers and sweetbread, too many of them turned out to be Nazis. A number of 2 million Ukrainians started to be uttered that would have to be killed in order for Russia to take possession of Ukraine. They also introduced early in the war the idea of freezing Ukrainians during winter, turning off their electricity, cutting off their plumbing. That would introduce death by freezing, the epidemics. And now we're seeing this unfold, which they have laid the groundwork for that back in the very beginning, in the early stages of this war. Now the rhetoric has become even more radical. It was always genocidal in its nature, but now it's very openly genocidal. Now they are saying they may have to destroy any cities that they can't take, and they may have to kill all Ukrainians who do not submit. And this war may last for a very long time, whereas in the beginning they estimated it would take minutes or days to run over all of Ukraine. They call this a holy war, which in their way is an excuse for killing as many people that do not submit as possible. And I've put together a little video presentation so that you could hear them in their own words. If you would play that, please.
В горячей войне мы Украину победим за 2 дня. Чего ее побеждать-то, господи, ну Украина.
Провоцировать очередной конфликт между славянами, от этого кто выиграет-то? Мы, что ли?
А почему мы не выиграем от того, если мы присоединим русские земли, населенные русскими?
Так
почему мы не
присоедините, вы
выиграем?
сначала, сколько народ там погибнет, надо только бить.
Нет,
понимаете,
опять-таки, Путин
прошло
сказал...
30 лет после распада СССР, только бить по Украине, бить по
Подожди,
Украине.
ну, извини, Коль, а как создавалась советская
Да,
Украина?
как создавалась? Войной. Вы сейчас готовы войной создавать
А
советскую
как считаешь, создаются великие империи?
Нет, нет.
Ну,
Хоть раз великие империи создавались без войны? Есть еще хоть один способ, который ты знаешь,
Но в
в
истории-
мире
в
создания
истории нет.
великой империи?
Только вариант силовой, никаких там Харьков там или Одесса, Юг, вас полностью вся Украина освобождена и ликвидирована как государство. Мы идем туда как освободитель, мы освободитель этой территории, это наша территория. И у нас сегодня есть преимущество. Не надо мучиться там, какие-то у нас слабые места. Нет у нас слабых мест никаких. Нас все боятся. Эта тщедушная, грязная Америка нам не указ.
Да вы знаете, на самом деле
Если говорить о том, о настроении харьковчан, вам же никто открыто не скажет, что ну минимум треть там, если не половина Харькова выйдет к этим войскам, которые если туда зайдут, как к освободителям. Харьков-то оборонять никто не будет. А что касается того, что кто-то будет оборонять Киев, вы знаете, если ситуация дойдет до того в условиях современной войны, Киев-то никто оборонять не будет.
Если будет, не дай бог, война, ну, разумеется, как минимум половина Восточной и Южной Украины встретят российскую армию цветами, как воинов-освободителей.
Абсолютное большинство жителей Украины, по большому счету, является пророссийским. Если вдруг где-то вот в некой сферической вакууме ситуации российские войска стали бы входить, они бы встречали наших военных просто с караваями и цветами. Я в этом даже не сомневаюсь. Фактически это наша территория.
Дайте даме договорить.
Опыта собственной государственности. И в любом случае, в исторической перспективе эта территория будет в орбите России.
В самом деле исторический день. Многие, конечно, задают вопрос, что дальше? Будет ли война? Хочется ответить всем и сразу. Как только туда войдет российская техника, война немедленно завершится.
Мы получим максимум 5% неизлечимых. В простом выражении 2 миллиона человек. Вот эти вот 2 миллиона человек должны были либо уехать с Украины, либо должны быть денацифицированы. То есть быть уничтожены.
Убьем сколько нужно, убьем 1 миллион, 5 миллионов, хоть всех истребим.
Убить не из чувства ненависти. Мы должны их убить из чувства любви к своим детям, потому что это обеспечит наше выживание.
Сейчас приходит в голову, еще раз скажу, уничтожить к чертовой матери все живое в Харьковской области в наказание, чтобы неповадно было.
Ее так вычистить, что там просто ничего не оставалось. Если мы говорим, что это Киев, мы говорим, там Киев, это мать городов русских. Да, это мать городов русских. Но если надо, чтобы от Киева остались руины, и там стоял наш флаг сверху на этих руинах, я думаю, к этому надо прийти.
Ну и вообще, конечно, для верующего человека очевидно, что они просто бесы. Какая была первая казнь? Первая казнь была реки крови. Мы что, не видим реки крови? Вот они, реки крови.
Наши цели святые. Мы русские, с нами Бог. А с вами кто? В аду будете гореть. Бесы! Не надо себя обманывать. Надо всех уничтожать их. Украины же нет и никогда не существовало.
А реально для России эта война была именно священной войной. Никак по-другому.
Мы сегодня на священном джихаде, на священной войне.
От вас зависит судьба страны. Если мы не победим, не Россия, мир исчезнет. Аллаху Акбар!
И с нами Бог. Мы или победим, или человечество исчезнет. А мы — оружие Господа и Его карающая десница.
А значит, мы будем добиваться этого покоя, чего бы это ни стоило и сколько бы это ни длилось, даже если будет дольше, чем наша жизнь.
Okay, that gives you a small taste of what appears on Russian state television every day for many hours. And part of what comes on that television is the announcements that the Russians have taken Pokrovsk, for example, in Donbass, or Kupiansk in the north, multiple times. And then Zelensky shows up in Kupiansk and takes a video of himself there as an easy way to puncture that balloon. So with that, let's turn to General Deptula about what's actually happening in the war. Please.
Well, thanks, Ambassador. As you know, we could probably spend the next hour just answering that question.
You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. I think I can do it relatively quickly. Let me summarize. What's really happening from a military perspective is not Russian inevitability. Obviously, it's a grinding war of attrition which Ukraine is holding, adapting, and denying Russia success despite enormous pressure. At every level of war, Russia has not met its objectives. At the strategic level, Russia's objectives were to rapidly capture Kyiv, replace Ukraine's government, destroy and then absorb Ukraine into Russia, and fracture the NATO alliance. Today, Kyiv is still the capital of Ukraine. Ukraine's government is fully functioning. It remains a sovereign country, and NATO is stronger today than before Russia invaded. 5 years ago, no one envisioned Sweden and Finland joining NATO, but they did. No one imagined that most NATO nations would double their defense budgets, but most of them have. Now, last Friday, about this time, I had the opportunity to visit the U.S. Air Base where we're training Finland's pilots in the F-35. And I had the opportunity to touch and inspect Finland's first F-35. That's something that was quite unimaginable before Russia's invasion. I just throw in one point that at some point I hope to see Ukraine acquire F-35s. We can discuss that later. At the operational level of war, Ukraine is holding Russia's military in place across a 1,000-kilometer front. Ukraine has negated their effective use of the Black Sea, and Ukraine has denied them air superiority over Ukrainian-controlled territory. At the tactical level, the nominal kill ratio for ground forces is 2.5 to 1 in Ukraine's favor. And in some fighting locations, it's been reported as high as 15 to 20 to 1. So even if Russia has moved westward a few kilometers in a few places along that 1,000-kilometer front, they've done so at enormous cost. So the comparison is clear. Russia's narrative promises inevitability, but the battle space reveals attrition without momentum, losses without leverage, and violence without decision.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Now, Casey Michelle. Casey, the real purpose, the ultimate purpose of the Kremlin propaganda narrative of their inevitable victory is actually to make sure Western leaders do not provide the support to Ukraine that is very much in the vital interests of the United States and our NATO allies. So in your judgment, what has been the impact of the Kremlin narratives on U.S. policy?
Well, John, of course,
thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to join everyone, even though I am, of course, being virtually beamed in today. The impact has frankly been devastating. This is a narrative that, as all the speakers have laid out thus far, has found some measure of success, not just in the past few months, but certainly going back to the origins of the war itself, and even, I would argue, long predating that. This idea of Russian inevitable victory has hamstrung policymakers in Washington and elsewhere, preventing them from doing everything they can and should to allow ultimate Ukrainian victory in this fight and convincing Russian troops to go home and convincing Putin himself of the inevitability of his ultimate strategic failure. This has been something that is not limited just to this administration. Of course, as we have the 4-year anniversary of the expanded war coming up, I'm thinking of the previous administration's initial thought that this would be a war that would potentially end in just a few days, and the Zelensky administration would be forced to set up a government in exile elsewhere. Of course, excuse me, as we well remember, President Zelensky's famous quote, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition," which is something that should have set the through line for policy responses thereafter, year after year. Again, it's not something that's limited to this administration, not something that's limited to the previous administration. You can go back to the Obama administration's response to the initial invasion in 2014, when the White House convinced Ukraine to stand down instead of standing up against the initial potential Russian invasion. You could even go back to things like 1991 and President George H.W. Bush saying it would be suicidal nationalism for the Ukrainians to declare any kind of independence, even though that was the clear desire from those on the ground then, and of course remains the clear desire right now. The overarching, the macro level narrative of Russian inevitable victory has been devastating in terms of Western and especially American response. Now, I know, John, we're going to get a little bit more into some of the other narratives as we get further into the conversation, but it is long past time, as the speakers have already detailed, for this quote-unquote illusion, as Speaker Stefanchuk already mentioned, to finally collapse so that we no longer ever think Russian victory is inevitable in this war.
Casey, thank you very much. And just to add one point, perhaps the greatest success Russia had, or one of the greatest success they had in pushing this false narrative, was to persuade U.S. intelligence agencies before the big invasion that Ukraine would be defeated very quickly, which amazed people like me or General Breedlove or General Ben Hodges or General Wesley Clark or Deborah Kagan, because we knew Ukraine well and knew that there's no way in the world the Russians were going to have an easy time of it. Okay. Mr. Speaker, over to you. What has been the impact, if any, of Russian war propaganda on Ukraine and Ukrainian morale? And what has been the Ukrainian reaction to Russian propaganda, some of which, thanks to Ms. Davis, we saw just on our screens, like Vladimir Solovyov, perhaps the chief propagandist in all of the Russias, as they used to say, exulting in the pain inflicted on Ukrainian civilians by strikes on residential areas, hospitals, and energy infrastructure?
You know, I would like to thank you for this question because I want to break it into several components. Before the big invasion started, Russian Federation indeed was very strong in its propaganda aimed at Ukrainian population. You know, we had a bunch of pro-Russian channels and Russian media, which sometimes were quite effective in influencing the thoughts of Ukrainians, some Ukrainians, who sometimes may also be wrapped in illusions, like they were saying, Russians are our brothers. But nobody said these are Cain and Abel, and the goal of that brother is to destroy Ukraine. Everything changed once the big invasion started, because those regions of Ukraine, which used to be most subjected to Russian propaganda, they were the first to be struck by Russian Federation. And so it was very hard to understand for those poor Ukrainians in those territories why Ukraine, which had been proclaiming its friendship, I mean, why the country that were saying they're your friend are shooting at your house, why they drive you and your child into the basement, and why they destroy everything you have. And today, Ukrainians very clearly understand who is your enemy number one. It is Putin, it is the Russian Federation, and Russians in general. So no one in Ukraine can say anything else because they're seeing this out of their own window. If you still have your apartment intact after a night strike by Russian Federation. I really don't want other countries to get the same experience, who really have the same danger if they don't give up their illusions about Russian Federation. I don't want them to watch how wrong this was out of the windows of their bombed apartments. So the question about this narrative about strong Russia, we all need to destroy it together. Ukrainians are ready to share their information, and again, I'm thankful for these connections with our colleagues, Speaker Johnson, members of the Senate and the House. When needed, they don't go to watch television channels, they just give me a phone call and I explain the situation in Ukraine directly. It's a great opportunity to talk directly with our colleagues and tell them about what we have in our country. But we are facing the question that perhaps even some similarity to information Rammstein needs to be created, because Russia has shown in some countries of the European Union that they can be successful, effective in their invasive information campaign. Look, one country of the European Union had nearly won presidential elections by the TikTok, and channels such as Telegram do influence the minds of young people who get information directly from there and very quickly. But what is loaded there? That's a question for special experts. And so this question needs to be faced by our partners as well, first and foremost by the United States of America, who have significant experience in fighting back against information attacks. Believe me, information is a weapon which hits at the front line, except it doesn't shoot into the body, it shoots into the mind and the heart of every person. So I'll be very thankful if here we also can put together our efforts for joint destruction of information narratives of the Russian Federation.
Comments. We have roughly 10 minutes left, so I'm going to dispense with the additional questions I've prepared for the panel. For people who are listening virtually, I should have mentioned this earlier, go to askac.org if you want to get a question to us virtually. Meanwhile, we'll take questions in the audience, but before that, I want to mention one thing. Okay, we have a question right here, but one thing before we do that. We saw the state propagandists, thanks to Julia, talking about the war. My recommendation for people, especially in the West, who naively take the official Russian line about the inevitability of their victory, is to pay attention to the Russian war correspondents, the Voyenkuri, who are largely super hawks, but deeply frustrated with Russian failures in this war. And they will tell you the same thing. People like Girkin Strelkov, who was very active in Ukraine in the early parts of the war, before the big invasion, saying Russia's not achieved one strategic, operational, or even tactical advantage, along the very same logic as General Deptula. And with that, okay, question over here.
Доброго дня. Good morning.
Good
I'm
morning.
Cohen. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. My question is to Ms. Davis. First of all, the movie is terrific. I want it. I'm going to distribute it for you. But can you drill down, please, on how the Russian propaganda system is engaging with the far right in Europe and in this country, turning the likes of Tucker Carlson and others into vehement opponents of Ukraine, into Putin's equivalent of Lord How, the propaganda piece that was a pro-Nazi Brit in Berlin in World War II. How you engage the know-nothing, I don't want to offend anybody, generation X, Y, Z, whatever those letters are. And to the general, to what extent Ukraine is a demonstration project for the Russian military vis-a-vis Europe, that if you don't do what we say, if you don't recede NATO, if we don't recede the weapons as they wanted before the war started in the fall of 21, in the Putin ultimatum, there were 2 documents there, if you remember, that these attacks on energy infrastructure, these attacks on civilian infrastructure and residential areas will happen to you. Thanks.
This is what's so interesting about the disparity between what the Russians say to their own domestic audience in Russian versus the way they engage Western audiences in their own languages. There are no similarities between them. They simply listen to what certain parties say, and then they try to appeal to their own interest and tell them what they want to hear. And instead of openly admitting that they want to conquer Ukraine and they want to restart some version of the Russian Empire, they claim that they want peace. And it's Zelensky who's standing in the way of it, which is certainly different than what they say to domestic audiences. So they basically listen to what their Western targets want to hear. They tell them what they think is in their interest, claim to support it, be it conservative values or religion or anything else, or how to fight against different parties. And head of our team, Margarita Simonyan, admitted they have more than 30 projects and their numbers are growing in a number of languages. They're weaponized information, obviously, and they will tell anyone whatever they want to hear, and not only making it seem like they're standing with them in their own interest, but also to make them to turn away from Ukraine. When they portray Ukraine as the aggressor who is ultimately responsible for this, who ultimately does not want peace, then those parties find it easier to say, okay, why should we support them, and turn the other way and side with Russia.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take a virtual question from Thomas Kent, who was once the head of RFERL, Radio for Europe. Sorry?
He had a second question.
Sorry?
He had a second question.
No, Ari, we only have a few questions, so sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so Thomas Kent, former head of RFERL, he wants to know, to what degree do you credit or blame the Western media for reinforcing a narrative of how the war is likely to turn out, meaning Russia's inevitable victory? And I think, Casey, this is for you.
Look, it's a fantastic question, and of course, I'm very happy to be joined by my former professor, Professor Kent, sending my regards. This is, of course, a responsibility, but I don't know that it's necessarily the responsibility in and of itself. That is to say, American media, Western media landscape more broadly, but of course, American media itself does rely on the policymaking community for information, for narratives, for strategic thoughts and considerations, and of course, for breaking any form of news around the world, even though they are reporting, even though they are analyzing. That is to say, that is not to say they're the ones themselves creating and crafting these narratives. I'm especially grateful for outlets like RFERL. I'm especially grateful for outlets like Voice of America, those that have tapped into the broader expert base, those that have given voice to those in Ukraine and not simply parroting what some policymaker somewhere else may have said about something. You know, these kinds of on-the-ground interviews in and around Ukraine, but of course not just limited to Ukraine itself, are going to be absolutely necessary moving forward to combat some of these narratives that have been for far too long, whether in the media space, but maybe even especially the policymaking space, going back decades, far too Moscow-centric, far too willing to listen to and elevate those narratives that are coming out of the Kremlin, not necessarily for any kind of malign or malignant reasons, but simply because that is where they had their connections, that is who they were able to talk to, and of course those in the Kremlin are more than happy to use those narrative mouthpieces or those mouthpieces on the ground in the media landscape to do their bidding and peddle those narratives in the first place.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question in the audience. I see a hand over here.
Hello, thank you. What does it say about the Western civilization when we are so easy to be manipulated by this Western propaganda, by this Russian propaganda?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm not sure that's one for you, Mr. Speaker, but I don't know. Julia, Casey, General, anyone want to take a shot at this? Okay, well,
I can't. Anyway, you can't let the question go unanswered. It doesn't speak well for the collective leadership of the West to be deterred by Putin's deception. And I think over time, people are beginning to wake up to that fact. And in order to actually prove that statement, the collective Western nations are going to have to continue to support Ukraine, because Ukraine will win if they're given the tools to enable them to do so. And that will allow us to make an actual statement of intent And that's what needs to happen. Putin only understands strength. Everyone in this audience knows that. So we have to begin to prove that peace through strength is not just a slogan. It has to be actualized.
General, thank you. That's a good way to sum things up. But I'm going to add one more thing before we close. This notion of Russian victory was one of the two reasons why the response from the Biden administration after the initial big invasion was as weak as it was. The other was that they were intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. This narrative, again, of Russian inevitable victory is surrounding the negotiations we see right now between, or among, I should say, the US, Ukraine, and Russia. And some may be well-intentioned, but naive observers have bought this line to say, well, of course Ukraine should give up the region of Western Donbass, which the Russian military has been unable to conquer for 4 years to get peace, because inevitably they're going to lose it, when in fact the evidence suggests the exact opposite. And with that, I would say keep an eye on that point, particularly in the days to come. And I'd like to thank again the speaker for honoring us with his presence. Not only did he give keynote remarks, but he also joined us on the panel, and that's a little bit unusual, and we're grateful for that. And thank you all for coming, and those who tuned in virtually. And we'll be doing a lot more on this in the weeks and months to come.